In this video, we're going to discuss the USB Defender and File Integrity Monitoring, also known as FIM. So let's start with the USB Defender. Both of these components are actually optional components of the Windows SEM agent. USB Defender is installed, a checkbox you can mark on for it, and FIM is actually just a really advanced connector you can set up after the fact for any of your Windows machines. So looking at USB Defender data here, I have a USB Defender events filter under my endpoint monitoring. I can just look at and see all the USB Defender events coming in. You see we have a little variety here, but I just created a couple more for just a random USB mass storage device I plugged in, a little key fob, and I can see quite a lot of data from this. So I see we received an attached event and a detached event from when I plugged in and pulled it back out. But we can see things like the event info, where it gives me a quick summary, including the device name. Typically, be a little more specific than this. We can see the USB Defender event and the associated number. We can see the account that actually plugged in the device. We can see the date and time it happened. We can see, most importantly, down here at the bottom, this extraneous info area right here, this extraneous info field. This extraneous info field for USB Defender events is always going to contain the USB device's specific unique ID. Now, I can use this data to populate different USB Defender related rules I might want to configure, such as automatically detaching a device, or adding it to my whitelist, or any other number of USB Defender related rules that I could configure with that. And we'll have a look at a couple of those. That's pretty much it. If I were to look at any file activity for USB Defender, it should show up here as well under things like file delete, file create, etc. Those type of events, you'll see that written here as well. So when you plug in a device, USB Defender is going to capture the attached events, detached events, any file activity that happens on the device as it happens, and you can create rules and reports around whatever you want to do about any of those things. So let's have a look at the nitty-gritty of this. If I go to my nodes, I can see under my node details here that just one of my agents, my laptop right here, has USB Defender installed and enabled. We have little filters that will show you that. And there's nothing I need to configure on this page to enable USB Defender. Again, it's just a toggle during the installation process. So if it's enabled, there is a background service called USB Defender that will run on the machine. And as long as that service is running, it will capture all those events we just specified. So the other big piece of USB Defender really is all about the rules. So you have the data, which is nice for reports, but you probably want to associate some rules with it to get the most out of it, right? So if we go to the create rule from template area and just search for USB, we have several USB Defender related rules that are actually all really useful, and I encourage you to clone and enable all these rules, okay? The primary rule we care about most of the time is detach unauthorized USB device. This will help us to easily enforce our USB policies, so to prevent people from copying and removing data from our network onto unauthorized devices. USB Defender service stop is also very useful because it will prevent any user who is a little bit wiser than your average user might want to stop the USB Defender service before they attempt to copy files off their network. But this rule here will monitor for and prevent that. Okay, and there are other rules here to help out with your USB management as well. Okay, specifically file monitoring and that sort of thing. So if I were to look at my USB Defender detached unauthorized USB device list, we're just going to have a quick look at this rule just to see how it's constructed. Now, just for your information, every USB Defender event that is not part of a file activity event, such as the file creates and file deletes, is going to show up as a system status event. So all of the fields we see here, or rather all of the conditions we see here, are system status events. We have event info that says attached. We just saw one of those events. Provider SID equals wildcard USB wildcard, because we want to limit this to USB Defender only. And this last one is what makes this rule unique, is it's looking at this extraneous info box, which, if you recall, is the field that contains the USB identifier. And it's comparing it to this list of authorized USB devices. This is a user-defined group that's configured out of the box that you can add your devices to essentially form a whitelist. So whenever someone attaches a device that's not in this authorized USB device whitelist, it will automatically If we go to the next screen, it will trigger these actions, which automatically detaches the device and sends that user a pop-up message saying, don't do that again, right? And all that's configurable, of course. Very useful rule to have. Now, USB Defender is a very useful tool, but it does require you to have an active agent, a connected agent to the SEM manager for it to work properly. So someone plugs in a device, USB Defender locally catches that and writes an event. The agent sends it over to the manager, which gets processed by the rules engine, which fires off a detach event, and you have that sequence of actions we just talked about. Now that's a problem if you have users that take their laptops home or otherwise disconnect from the network. If they're not online with the SEM manager, it can't go through that series of events to detach that unauthorized device. So there is a backup option for this. If you go to the nodes page and go to any of your Windows machines, such as my laptop, and just do a search for USB, you'll see there is an active response connector called USB Defender Local Policy. And if I were to configure this connector, it's going to ask me to point to a policy file. This is just a text file you can create. In that text file, you want to add, essentially you want to duplicate your whitelist. So you want to add the unique USB identifiers one at a time, and then save that text file and just point it to that file, and it will essentially save a local copy of your whitelist to that agent. So if it's ever offline and someone takes a laptop home for the weekend, the policy will still be in place. It will still have a list of devices or a list of identifiers to compare the attached device with, and then decide if it wants to fire the rule or not. Okay, so a nice little backup option for you should you desire that. Moving on to file integrity monitoring, also known as FIM. We can get that started by simply adding the FIM connector. So I'm going to go to one of my machines here, and we're just going to do a search for FIM. We have two options here, file and directory and registry. They're both basically configured the same way, and they both basically do the same thing, but one is for obviously your file and directory stuff, and one is for your registry keys. So if you want to monitor, keep a close eye on specific registry keys so they're not altered or deleted, you can do that as well. But we'll configure a file and directory because that's a little more common. And just like the rules, you have two options here. You can create from scratch, or you can configure from a template. If I look at the templates, we have several starter options here, and a couple I've created myself. But these will help you get started, especially if you're under some sort of compliance auditing, right? So if I'm PCI DSS, I can start with this. It's going to create my connector. It's going to start it up automatically, but we can still edit it. And here is the configuration screen for FIM. Now these are the half dozen or so entries that the PCI starter kit added for me. You can see we're monitoring things like EXEs and batch files and INI files, etc. Looking on the root drive in the C Windows folder recursively. Okay. Now these are fine to start with. I may want to alter these as necessary, but I can also just add my own. So I can click on Create Inclusions and decide and basically add what I want to monitor. So I can click the Browse button and point it to any of the local drives. I'll just go to my C drive, maybe monitor the Windows folder. Okay, then I want to decide what I want to actually monitor for. So I need to add a mask here. I first decide if I want recursive or non-recursive, so Windows in every subfolder and subfile beneath it, or just straight up the Windows folder. But then I need to add a mask. So what specific naming format, file name, or extension do I want to monitor for? And it's anything you want it to be, right? So I can do Windows or Word documents if I wanted to. Okay. Finally, I choose the actions I want to monitor for. So things like creating, deleting the file and the folder. I may want to monitor for file changes, so I could turn on this write action. I may want to monitor for permission changes. I can add that as well. You can also add the read actions, but just as a personal preference, I found that the read actions and the other section for these are not as useful as these other options that I have selected, and they tend to be much more verbose, so you're going to get a lot of them, especially the read options. So feel free to play around with it, decide what works for you. But my personal recommendation is to go with the minimum as far as FIM is concerned, because it is very easy to get a lot of FIM events in your SEM very, very quickly, especially if you're deploying this to a very active file server or a lot of different machines. Your FIM events will add up very, 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 very quickly. So I'm just going to add this, and the final thing I could do here is create an exclusion. So if I click on that, this basically allows me to exclude any particular mask that I want to exclude from my my monitoring here. So for example, if I'm monitoring everything happening in a specific folder, I could create an exclusion and say, okay, I want to monitor everything in this folder but this particular mask. So I could do like the example says and exclude all text files from everything. Okay. Important note on the exclusions. Exclusions are global, which means if I create an exclusion here and I go configure FIM on other machines, on other nodes, the exclusion is going to apply to those as well. Okay, so an important note on that one. So finally, I hit next and then save, and this will reconfigure my FIM connector. It should stay started or restart as necessary, and I'm now monitoring all those folders and files for that particular series of actions that I sped up. If we wanted to have a quick look at what these events look like, I can head to my Events tab, and I have a FIM folder down here. And you'll see that these are all pretty much the standard file creates, file deletes, file reads, file data reads, file data writes, etc. All these sort of different file auditing related events that we're going to see here. So just as an example here, we have some file data reads. Here's a file delete. Okay, this file was deleted by something. Let's see here. If I look at the information, it was deleted by my account on my machine. Here's the exact path, date, timestamp, etc. Any other pertinent details will be here. And that's it. You can easily create a FIM event, or a FIM filter rather, as necessary, altering it as needed. One recommendation for the filter I would just put in here for everybody is you probably want to add a second condition onto this that's something like this. Okay, one of the side effects of SIM, because it is built off of or rather it receives its data from a mini filter driver on the host system, on the agent system. It's basically interpreting in log format what the Windows kernel is interpreting your actions as doing. So the kernel is interpreting my file delete action in a specific way, and the driver's picking that up. Okay. Now, one of the side effects of that is you're going to get a lot of events that are coming from the NT-authority/system account, because Windows is always touching files, just read actions. It's always touching a bunch of different files. You're going to get a lot of these events just par for the course. Okay. There's nothing really much you can do to prevent that from happening other than altering your output of data. So in this example, I've added a second condition that says exclude all events that come from the system account, essentially. So I use the event info here. I could also probably just use the source account to make it more precise. But you could do something like this on your old filters to prevent that from happening. You can also do that with any reports you run for FIM or file-related activity, etc. And that essentially sums up USB Defender and file integrity monitoring. Thanks for your attention. We'll see you next time.